We're in this together. In the Romans passage read to us this morning from the Message translation, the words that stood out for me were from verse 2. We throw open our doors to God and discover at the same moment that He has already thrown open His door to us. We find ourselves standing where we had always hoped we might stand, out in the wide spaces of God's grace and glory, standing tall and shouting our praise. Reverend John and I have been reflecting on this time of the COVID-19 pandemic and the sense that we are living in what some might call liminal times, a time in the threshold where we are living in this current moment, unable to move forward or back. And as the weeks have dragged on, many are feeling frustrated, angry, some depressed or discouraged, and finding it increasingly difficult to imagine this going on much longer. As things begin to open up again, there is fear that we might end up back where we started, with another outbreak of this virus. And what little progress we've made to get the economy going again and our lives back to normal will be set back once again. And in the midst of all of this uncertainty, we have the death of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer whose service was to protect and serve, not punish and abuse, causing death. I cannot breathe were his last words that have become the voice of protest of millions who, like Floyd, are echoing his plea. I cannot breathe. Over 6,000 protesters gathered in downtown Guelph a week ago last Saturday to peacefully yet profoundly demonstrate that enough is enough. And so in this threshold time of our society that demands a new way forward, a new normal, I hear an echo of Paul's words spoken centuries ago, that even in the threshold of new times, a future that have yet to be seen realized, there is hope. Paul writes, "We boast in our suffering, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us." I wrestle with the idea that suffering is seen here to be honored or lifted up as a good thing, a necessary thing. I hate to see others suffer. I can't watch violent scenes in movies. I cannot watch another replay of George Floyd's death on the news. I cannot bear to think of a person suffering at the hands of another. And so I stop watching the news. I find it too upsetting. I feel weepy at times at the injustice of it all. And I feel angry. And I feel helpless. Just over 55 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to crowds who had marched from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, in his famous speech, "How long? Not long." He encouraged the peaceful and nonviolent march for the rights of Blacks to vote, the march against segregation, against the economic inequality of so many, food insecurity, substandard housing, unemployment that was disproportionately class or race-driven. He heard people say they wanted the demonstrations to stop so that things could get back to normal. I hear that today. Many want things back to normal. But Martin Luther King Jr. responded, "The only normalcy that we will settle for is the normalcy that recognizes the dignity and worth of all God's children. The only normalcy that we will settle for is the normalcy that allows judgment to run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. The only normalcy that we will settle for is the normalcy of brotherhood, the normalcy of true peace, the normalcy of justice. He understood that all of this would not come easily. He said that there were still difficult days ahead. He went on to say, we are still in for a season of suffering. In many of the Black Belt counties of Alabama, areas of Mississippi, and areas of Louisiana, I must admit to you that there is still jail cells waiting for us and dark and difficult moments. But if we will go on with the faith that nonviolence and its power can transform dark yesterday into bright tomorrows, we will be able to change all of these conditions. And here we stand on the threshold once again, over half a century later, and so many are still suffering, and many have run out of patience. And I cannot imagine what it is to suffer as a person of color, as a people who have been subjected to generations of abuse and injustice. And at this time, I wrestle with what my faith asks of me. What is my role in all of this as a white woman of privilege? I wrestle with these words of Paul that somehow justify or sanctify suffering. I have trouble with the idea that an individual who suffers does so for a reason. Sometimes suffering is just suffering. And yes, we can learn or experience new things because of it, but I don't see it as always redemptive. Sometimes it is just painful and too hard to bear. Reverend Dr. Janet Hunt, in reflecting on Paul's words, noted that much suffering is experienced individually, but the promise Paul extends today is grounded in God's people all being in this together. She goes on to suggest that perhaps Paul is speaking more on the idea of the suffering we do on behalf of one another. He uses the word we instead of I. She's suggesting that whenever we suffer along with another, as Christ did for us and the two thieves on either side of him on the hill outside of Jerusalem, on behalf of the world, then that is actually the kind of suffering that leads to endurance and character and the kind of hope that does not disappoint. I realize that as I observe another's suffering, I feel pain and anguish that only feeds my own sense of vulnerability or helplessness. But I must make an effort to be with that person in their suffering, to pray for them, to hold their hand, to walk in solidarity, be it a march in downtown Guelph, or to support legislation that breaks down barriers and prejudice, or to vote for policies and laws that truly protect and promote the well-being of all citizens. I must speak out when I hear language that belittles or discriminates against another because of the color of their skin or their gender identification. I need to stand with the one suffering. No one should suffer alone. We are in this together. As Christ said, when one part of the body hurts, we all hurt. It can no longer be us and them. It must be we. It's not black or brown suffering. It's not LGBTQ or straight suffering. It's not rich or poor suffering. It's not employed or unemployed suffering. It's not healthy or ill suffering. It's humanity suffering for not being what God envisioned us to be. I still don't know the best way that I can support others in their suffering, especially when it comes to the experience of racism. But I do know that the first thing I need to do is listen and open my eyes to what is going on around me. There's no excuse for me to ignore it or be ignorant of it. I need to listen, to truly listen and hear the stories of others' pain of prejudice. I need to learn. And in faith, I need to act, speak out, walk in solidarity with others to make the voice of justice and mercy stronger. One of the signs at the protest said, "I may not understand, but I stand with you." And then hopefully, the words of Martin Luther King Jr., "How long, not long," will finally be realized. And then perhaps Paul's words will finally ring true, that hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who was given to us. How long must this suffering go on? Hopefully not long as we love and hope and bring about long overdue changes in our hearts, in our churches, in our communities, in our policies, in our laws and in our businesses, in our world, together. Because make no mistake, we are in this together. How long? Martin Luther King asked. Let's respond, no longer. We throw open our doors to God and discover at the same moment that He has already thrown open His door to us. We find ourselves standing where we had always hoped we might stand, out in the wide spaces of God's grace and glory, standing tall and shouting our praise. How long? No longer. May it be so. By God's grace, amen.